Please be seated. And welcome to this welcoming place. This has been the gathering place of Christian worshippers for almost 1,000 years now. 100 decades of listening to those powerful, simple words we just heard in the reading from Romans. Love your neighbour as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbour. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law, of God's law. The reading from Jeremiah, predictably in rather graphic language, warns what happens when God's people disobey his law. The sad reality is that we don't need any more lessons to teach us what happens when neighbour fails to love neighbour. Down the sweep of these past 1,000 years, the world has seen time and time again what happens when hatred rules human hearts. We've seen it on an international scale when wars consumed our own continent. We see it still. We've seen it on a national scale when the War of Independence, Civil War and the Troubles consumed our own beautiful island. Now, we're a fortunate generation to be building a peace among estranged neighbours and to be witnessing the first green shoots of the fulfilling of the law that exhorts us to love one another and promises that human beings flourish best in love. And we don't need any more lessons in that truth either, because in this gathering and on the streets of our city and anywhere in our country, there are people who can tell of the damage caused by the absence of that love in their homes, their workplaces, street corners, sports clubs, their communities, their religious faith systems, the internet, where hate-filled invective, judgmentalism, cancelling, stereotyping has made life intolerable, driven so many people to despair, driven too many to see no point in continuing to live. We have seen off in our own time and country oppressive and ignorant laws that made the lives of gay men and women hide in the shadows of life, afraid to live openly in the fullness of life and love as God intended them to. And sad to say, we see it still in so many parts of the world where harassment, persecution, prosecution are all too present and worryingly all too often justified by religious teachings drawn from the very Old and New Testaments that we have just listened to. We're a fortunate generation in so many ways to have had here in Ireland that miraculous day of grace back in 2015, when the voters of Ireland overwhelmingly endorsed same-sex marriage, and in so doing set their faces and our future outwards towards full liberty, full equality, an end of repression. But talking last week to Noel Cunningham, one of Ireland's best known and most accomplished hoteliers and a living authority on the gay experience in Ireland, he forcefully said that despite that wonderful day of grace, that life for LGBTIQA plus citizens is still fraught with everyday difficulties and ever-present threats of violence on the streets of our cities and towns. He said he would not walk the streets of our city, our capital city, at night. 70-year-old man. He spoke of how demeaned and how belittled he felt when the head of his church and mine, a global religious leader of 1 in 6 of the world's population, twice in recent times used vulgar, locker room homophobic language in private settings with pastors with church leaders. I know many deeply religious men and women, both hetero and homosexual, will have shared his dismay and disappointment, and also the fear that such malign language can influence greatly. Only in recent days we heard of the violent assault on a hugely courageous young woman who challenged the use of that very word here in Ireland and paid the price when she heard it shouted by strangers at strangers and stood her ground and took them on. We've heard too and too often of random, unprovoked attacks on young gay men and women. And yet, we have to say, in this overwhelmingly Christian country, there can be no doubt that the racists, the homophobes, the misogynists will all have heard the words, time and again, of the great commandment to love one another, and yet will have ignored them. Worse still, will have edited them cynically to fit the mean abuse of God they have made in their own awful image and likeness. And because they do, and because of the damage they cause every day, still including to themselves, the world still needs to hear that love is the way. The world needs to see love in action, and that's why we gather here in this house of God, welcomed, loved, embraced, straight, gay, friends and family, in loving solidarity, and with hearts filled with pride at the courageous love this gathering signifies, where all are genuinely wanted, genuinely welcomed, genuinely equal, and supported by one another. This Pride Evensong in Christ Church, a cathedral which has proclaimed the name of Christ for almost 1,000 years, is a statement of intent about the next 1,000 years. That to the extent that we can, we will insist on the right of all of us to love, to respect, to equality, to be free from wrongs inflicted by ignorance, bigotry, stereotyping, and importantly, to call it out wherever it appears. Of all the decades that we could have lived through, there are few probably as good as this one. It is better than most. It's not as good as it could be, but it is better than most. That it is as good as it is thanks to the courage and the sacrifice of so many who first lifted the Pride banner 50 years ago in very, very hostile times. They were few then, but they refused to settle for laws, attitudes, biases, and languages that rendered them second-class citizens, made them vulnerable to violence and to untold and utterly unnecessary heartache. They brought out into the open the damage visited upon them and on all of us, the loss to all of us, visited upon us by prejudice and hate-filled language that festered unchallenged so often in private spaces, in what people regarded as safe spaces, but that made toxic the public place, whether in streets or laws or attitudes or actions. Pride helped to change attitudes, to change Ireland. So this is by far the best decade for LGBTIQA plus men and women here, but in no way can anyone who proclaims the commandment to love one another settle for how things are. If the best is yet to come, and we hope that it will, we believe that it will take more courage, more work, more pride gatherings, more solidarity, until all that miserable hatred is squeezed out by pride, by lived love of neighbour, until the oxygen that keeps hatred going is all gone. And we know a time when love flourishes. That Ireland has changed, and changed profoundly, came home to me in a very, very special way just a few weeks ago. I was coming back from a long period in Rome, where the Vatican was reeling from the hostile global reaction to Pope Francis's homophobic locker room language. The shock and the pain of my gay friends and their families, the shock and pain of people both lay and clerical, was just plain awful. I had texts and emails from all over the world from many people saying how tested they were in their faith, and I knew how they felt. I thought of that great poem, the great stanza at the end of the old epic poem, love poem, Donal Og. You took my east, you took my west, you took my north, you took my south. You took the sun from me, you took the moon from me, and I do believe you took my very God from me. So many people were in that way of thinking. And it was in pretty much that mood of dejection and frustration that my husband and I disembarked the plane and entered Dublin Airport, Terminal 2. The place was decked out wall to wall in rainbows. Wall to wall, everywhere. North, south, east, west, rainbows. Proclaiming this month of Pride in Dublin, saying loud and clear that Dublin, that Ireland, is a place that has Pride's back, that is proud of Pride and all it stands for. My husband and I looked at each other and laughed with joy. Here was love in action. Here was proof positive of the power of love, and importantly, the power of pride in pushing the LGBTIQA+ community from hiding in the wings of life right to the centre stage. Everyone exiting that airport, whether heading east or west, north or south, could be left in no doubt that God's people will do whatever it takes for however long it takes to fulfill the law of love. Pride will go from strength to strength because there is no confusion here. It has the innate integrity of insisting that the world will only know its best day, its greatest fulfillment, when love finally deprives hatred and prejudice of all the oxygen that keeps on feeding them. We still inhabit the canton of expectation that Seamus Heaney wrote about in a slightly different context when he said, "I yearn for the hammer blows on clinkered planks, the uncompromised report of driven thole pins, to know that there is one among us who never swerved, from all his instincts told him was right action, who stood his ground in the indicative, whose boat will lift when the cloudburst happens." Pride is building that boat. It will lift. There will be the cloudburst that will lift that boat, and it will last at least 1,000 years. And I want to thank the Dean, to whom we offer wishes for a very speedy recovery. I want to thank Bishop Trevor for being here. I want to thank Jenny Kennerly and indeed all the members of this great community, the Church of Ireland community, and all who are involved with Changing Attitudes Ireland, for the warm and gracious welcome received here. It's not in every place that this calls itself Christian. that this welcome can be taken for granted, regrettably. So it's an honour. It's an honour to be here, to meet the open heart, where we meet the commandment to love one another at work, in action. I'm also particularly grateful to Changing Attitudes Ireland for the work they do to sustain and develop a tolerant and truly inclusive Ireland, to show how love can be fully realised. And now for the privilege of being a patron of that organisation that keeps on challenging Christians to break down the barriers that keep neighbours from loving one another as Christ commanded. When all those barriers are down, when all those walls are down, there will be a generation that will feel the flood, the cloudburst of love. Wouldn't it be wonderful? Wouldn't it be wonderful to be part of that generation? Thank you.